This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a critic, a writer and the host of Writers on Film. Today I have a special guest. I'm talking to Kim Newman, who has written extensively about film for decades. He is the author of a whole bunch of books. You might know his landmark study on horror movies, nightmare movies as it was called, as well as a film critic and as well as a writer about film. He is also a successful novelist with the Anno Dracula series of books, his brilliant alternative history, a twist on Dracula and kind of anybody in late 19th, early 20th century literature, going all the way through to the 1970s and La Dolce Vita in Italy and the whole thing. It's absolutely great. Really, really good series of books. Really enjoy them. He's got a new novel out at the moment called Something More Than Night, which features Raymond Chandler and Boris Karloff solving crimes in Los Angeles. A noirish, behind-the-scenes look at Hollywood. It's a really great feat of the imagination, brilliantly written. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like it and to share with all your friends and with everybody who you know, or maybe even just publish it on social media, because let's face it, they're mostly going to be strangers reading it there anyway. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
You know what? I'm not entirely sure I can remember the end of things. Once the book's done, it quite often fades. And sometimes it's like years later, I'll have to, reread it to proof a new edition or something. And I'm capable of being surprised by my own work, which is nice.
That must give you the feeling of being like a reader, like a proper. Have you ever sort of reread something and thought, "Wow, those twists are great," and that writing's stunning?
Not quite. I do laugh at my own jokes, which I know you're not supposed to, but I do chuckle. And usually what you do is you just say, oh, God, I've used the word facade 3 times on the page, that kind of stuff. I probably worry a bit too much much about that. And now, because yeah, now it's so easy to word search in documents. Yeah, I think occasionally I fall over backwards not to use a slightly unusual word twice in like a 700-page manuscript, which literally nobody in the world is going to care about except.
I don't know. I certainly have those moments where I go, oh, he said finagle again.
Yeah. Wow. Oh well. So it is worth that extra pass.
Just for me. Yeah.
Just to make sure of that. And with this one, because I'm trying to write in somebody else's voice, I had to put all Raymond Chandler's books in a big document and go through to check his vocabulary. And even then, that's slightly dodgy because, of course, most of his books are written in the authorial viewpoint of Philip Marlowe, who isn't Raymond Chandler. But it gives you a sense of the words he used.
I was wondering about what you feel about Raymond Chandler, because he's a writer who I admire, and I've admired for a while. But I always think of that meeting he had and the collaboration he had with Billy Wilder, and I tend to side with Wilder.
Yeah, I do, except it maybe as somebody who's worked with people in the industry, I think Wilder also comes across as insufferable in that. Neither of them come out well from that, is it, except of course the work they did was outstanding. So there are Chandler only lasted like a week and a half with Hitchcock. Yeah, whereas Wilder stuck with it. There are various other writer in Hollywood stories about it. But of course, the Chandler who wrote the scripts and the Chandler who wrote the novels had very different work ethics. I think he had this thing a lot of novelists have when they turn to cinema, and I'm not immune of this, of realizing that a novel is 100,000 words and a script is 15,000 words. It's a lot less work. But the meetings that go along with it are just excruciating. That's why it takes as long to write a script as it does to write a novel. The meetings. And Chandler had little patience with the meetings. I think the meetings are the things you sort of grudgingly put up with at the beginning of the process that do the novelty wears very thin quite early on.
And where was the idea of pairing him with Boris Karloff? When was that when did that come to you?
It shows how long this book's been in the back of my mind. Their centenaries fell within a couple of months of each other. So in 1988, that would have been.
Oh my God. So you've been percolating for that long?
Yeah, that's right. And I knew it's always been one of those things. One of the reasons it's taken me so long to get round to actually writing the book is more and more research kept being done. So the pile of books just got higher and higher. And obviously, once you realize they're the same age, and then it's just the fact that Chandler went to Dulwich College and Boris Karloff, William Pratt, lived in Dulwich at about the same time. And then, of course, working out that, and they would have lived in Hollywood at about the same time. And they both had a complicated relationship with the idea of being British. In that both of them sort of were and sort of weren't. Chandler was born in Chicago and was Irish American, but very probably indoctrinated is what we would now say by his time particularly in Dulwich College, but in Britain in general. And Boris Karloff was Anglo-Indian. So British, but as they said at the time, coloured. And therefore, he adopted this persona of being a foreigner everywhere, of being at once the perfect Englishman, but also, this name Boris Karloff, which is it's sort of astonishingly fake foreign name that no one ever seems to have called him on. I don't think he ever actually adopted it legally either. It's a name he just pulled out of his hat because it sounds like a foreigner.
It kind of sounds Russian or Eastern European or something.
But it's not a real name, I think. And then they both had, exemplified genres I was particularly in love with. The film noir, hard-boiled private eye mystery, and the classic Universal monster movie horror film. And I'd been wanting to write something in that vein for a long time. And then it just kept floating around in the back of my head as it is for years, to the extent that I think it's been taken down now, but the synopsis or the blurb that was on Amazon was based on like the first notes I wrote some decades ago, and resembles the finished product almost not at all. When I started out, I think I must have been really influenced by David Lynch, because it was going to be one of those. The murder was going to be an actress, whereas now it's a detective. And I realize what it is. In the interim, there have been too many, particularly TV series about middle-aged detectives obsessing over dead young women. And I figured we didn't need another one of those.
The Black Dahlia and the...
That's right. But that was my first sort of pass at the idea. And yeah, the Black Dahlia is called that because Raymond Chandler wrote a script called The Blue Dahlia. That's why her name is mispronounced, because it's mispronounced in the film.
I knew about the screenplay, but I knew about the film, but I didn't know that was the reason that they called the real life murder.
Yeah, because it was a couple of months later. And the mispronunciation that's in the film carried over to the... And obviously that in as it were, that version of the story that I didn't write was going to be tied up with that. I think probably the fact that there were two really good novels about the Black Dahlia, True Confessions and the Black Dahlia, also dissuaded me from going anywhere near that. I've cut off enough with this one. It's like there's enough stuff to trip over without that.
And it also gives you a great opportunity to go into Hollywood in that era as well. As well as the noir and the horror, there's the sort of behind the scenes aspect.
Yeah, I love doing that. I realized early on that apart from some of the key works that my main characters were involved in, I wanted to make up a movie studio. And once I do that, I thought, well, yeah, I could almost sit down and just write a book about this studio and all the westerns they've made and the musicals and the terrible comedies and all this kind of stuff. And so I had reams of notes on that. Yeah, I know that Quentin Tarantino's writing the films of Rick Dalton about his Once Upon a Time in America character, and I'm really tempted to write the Pyramid Studios biography at some point.
You should write a non-fiction book about the Pyramid Studios in which you go into it as if it all exists.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. Yeah, I'd love to write. Yeah, I mean, I think I ended up cutting bits of it because it can get really indulgent, and there was also a question of how much knowledge my viewpoint characters would have had, but yeah, no, I love doing all that. Say it with tubers. That's why I'm tempted almost to to script it. I have once for a charity thing I wrote script which was like a 1930s British quota quickie, like a film that would be impossible to make now, but would have worked really well then. So that sort of thing does appeal to me. Who knows? I might find time. Yeah.
I love the Marx Brothers sort of. They call it the Spark Brothers.
The Sparks Brothers, yeah, which is a bit on the nose. And of course, I wrote it before Edgar Wright made that documentary about the band Sparks. But go on YouTube and look at some clips of the Ritz Brothers, who were a sort of knockoff of the Marx Brothers at the time, and whose films have not worn well. I think they were probably pretty excruciating at the time. They made a version of The Three Musketeers and an old dark house movie called The Gorilla. But their style of comedy is so obnoxious that it's almost interesting.
In what way is it obnoxious? Is it just...
Well, it's just... I mean, it's sort of like the verbal equivalent of the Three Stooges. It's just insult humor, but it's kind of like feeble as well. It's It's bad jokes delivered really fast. It's bad jokes shouted at you in the hope that it'll bludgeon you into laughing. It is that sort of, anything for effect approach, which the Marx Brothers, to their credit, didn't do, although they were legendarily undisciplined and crazy. Their best movies are rather elegantly put together. And they always have a harp solo in the middle to calm you down between the uproarious comedy.
The Ritz Brothers just sound like an old-fashioned version of the Scary Movie franchise. Just lots of bad jokes, energetically fired. Speaking of scary movies, I think the first book I've read of yours was a long time ago, and it was your Nightmare Movies book. That's an amazing encyclopedic sort of survey at the panorama of horror movies. And I'm quite interested in that definition that you give it of nightmare movies, where you sort of try to shift the genre definition a little bit.
Yeah, it's partly because horror, like comedy, is a genre of effect rather than structure, isn't it? It's designed to frighten you or disturb you, and there is an obvious central tradition of horror. I mean, which you could argue is, I don't know, Frankenstein or The Exorcist. Although, everybody who made The Exorcist bent over backwards to say it wasn't a horror movie. The Lying Toads. Halloween, films that look like horror movies. They have monsters in, and actually that sort of the gothic look of 1930s Universal horror films, or the color version that you get in Hammer film, is so influential. But you can make horror films that look different or work around the frames, and there is this sort of thing. I mean, and you can also use the look of horror films to tell different types of stories. If you look at The Sweet Smell of Success or Network, they are lit like horror films. They're paced like horror films, although they are social satire. I think the best example and I do use it in the book, is if you compare Michael Mann's Manhunter and Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs, which are based essentially on the same material. They have a lot of scenes that are the same. Manhunter is set in a high-tech thriller world where Hannibal Lecter is kept in a well-lit cell. Whereas in The Silence of the Lambs, he's basically kept in the dungeons of Castle Dracula. Is there somewhere you would not put a mental patient? In the world of Silence of the Lambs is a gothic horror world, and Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, uses mannerisms from Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, whereas Brian Cox doesn't. And so it's horror films, sometimes it's an overcoat you can put on, as well as a commercial genre that there's an impetus to make.
I was thinking, I mean, that's so true of Silence of the Lambs as well, because he even has Clarice Starling sort of go into the darkness with that wonderful shot where she goes into the tunnel and you see the diminishing spot of light. It's so good. Yeah,
but also the hands coming out from the other cells, which is from a Val Lewton film called Bedlam that Robert Wise directed. It's like the whole look of it is gothic horror, and it is, and I think that's why. And after Silence of the Lambs 7 did something very similar, and to take it all down to the current day, so does The Batman. These aren't strictly horror films, but they look like horror films. If you took just frame grabs and threw them up alongside frame grabs from a whole bunch of Dracula movies, they would seem to mingle together. You can see the similarities. You can see the look is always there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Batman Begins, the Christopher Nolan, the scene at the docks is played, and the Christian Bale Batman is himself like the monster, basically, just sort of the vampire, and of course, wearing a cape. I mean, it's
I think that's probably down to Bob Kane and Bill Finger in the first place, isn't it? I think in fact, again, it's a really complicated story about the creation of Batman. It's that Bob Kane seemed to want to do just a knockoff of Superman, And it was Bill Finger, the artist, who said, no, make him dark. Yeah. And so that's why the very early Batman is very influenced by Universal horror. There was even one of the villains who hasn't appeared in a live action movie so far is Clayface, who was originally a sort of Boris Karloff character. He was a horror film actor who was deformed because of an accident with makeup and became a Gotham City bad guy. They should probably do him next because he's actually quite a good character.
Just anything to avoid another Joker film would be.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any problem with comic book movies per se, but it seems like we're watching the same one several times.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. I'm not as impatient with comic books films as some of my fellow critics are. I grew up reading those comics. I have a deep and abiding interest in these stories, even the characters nobody cares about. I do, but yeah, I don't think we need another rerun of the same 4 or 5 key moments. It's like I was really glad that Batman didn't go back to Crime Alley and have another shooting, but it is like, yeah, I'd like to see a X-Face story now, or a good Mr. Freeze story.
Yes.
Run through very very samey material.
Following on from the sort of horror, the idea of sort of thinking differently a little bit about horror. I find that especially with American horror movies, there seems to be 2 sort of strands, whereas there's this sort of action movie horror, which is very much based on sort of a series of elaborate kills or set pieces, but they're very much action movies. So, for instance, the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre felt to me like I was just watching, it was dressed up in horror clothes, but it was really an action movie. And then there's the sort of Ari Aster and the Hereditary and it goes way beyond actually a lot of English films where there's a kind of pushing the horror movie into social directions and into different directions, which aren't as much to do with that sort of action aesthetic. What does that stand up? I'm coming to the king for a judgment.
Yeah. I'm slightly impatient with the notion that horror films having sort of social content or qualities is anything new. Frankly, 100 years since Nosferatu, and that does that. I think that most of the really great horror films address deep and powerful and potent themes, even in that kind of the yawning existential chasm of something like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is kind of about the meaninglessness of horror. Then you're right, there's also the production line horror, meat grinder horror. And it's not simply the fact that there are these body count movies, they call them. There have been other production lines over the years, 1940s B horror movies, or slasher sequels in the 80s, or even that run of kind of PG-rated, teen-themed ghost stories that we had a couple of years back, where a formula works, and so dozens of other people do it. Zombie movies or found footage movies. But it may also be that, and this is what I was fascinated by in nightmare movies, that sometimes when a subgenre suddenly catches on, and within a couple of years, 100 very similar films are made, there's got to be something interesting there. It can't just be, Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist or The Blair Witch Project or Jaws with big hits. So let's make a film that's a bit like that. Yeah, I think you can get away with that for 3 or 4 movies, but 100 movies you can't. There's got to be something going on, something that's deeply felt or meaningful, or it's a story that people want to hear again and again.
Well, one of those subgenres that came out around about the time that I read your book actually was the torture porn series, which seems to have come to a bit of an end now. I don't.
Yeah, I've seen 1 or 2 lately that are sort of, the thing is that it is that thing, you watch something. I felt a bit like that about the new Texas Chainsaw. I thought, that's such a 2005 movie, isn't it? And it's like we've gone, and I saw, a little film that's just coming out called Fresh, which looks very contemporary, but there's a long central act which is a girl chained up in a cellar. And you think, oh God, yeah, and we got fed up with those films, and I think maybe it's a case that when you're a critic, especially if you specialize in this area, there is a sort of compulsion to watch, if not all, then most of these movies. And I do remember the thing of around 2007, when torture porn was a big thing, you'd like go to Fright Fest or a horror festival, and you'd have just a really miserable time because people one after another chained up in the basement movies. Yeah, and they were drab, crude, depressing, often really mean-spirited, and it just was not a fun time. Yeah. And I'm not arguing that all horror should be amusing on that, but I think sometimes, you have to go really dark. I think, but it's like comedy, there is cheap horror as well as cheap jokes, isn't there? Cheap laughs. You can always get a laugh with some things, and you can always get a shudder with some things. That's not the same as saying we necessarily need to see it again. And there are certainly some tropes that I'm happy to see fall out of favour.
I did see a couple of sort of good torture porn films, but as on a whole, it's that notion of being mean-spirited that I think is essential. Yeah. It's more than eye trauma or anything else. But apropos your point about some social satires being shot like horror movies, have you seen the recent French film Bloody Oranges?
No, I haven't.
Right. Well, I won't spoil anything, but it isn't a horror movie, but by God, it has a scene in it which is pretty horrific. I'll leave that there.
Put it on my to be watched list, which currently stands at longer than À la recherche du temps perdu. But
going back, to the mean-spirited idea that you mentioned earlier, are there sort of certain horror films that you sort of find difficult to watch because of that sort of mean-spirited, even if you admire the film?
Yeah, it's more a cumulative effect than an individual film effect. I mean, to look at the key texts of torture porn, which would be probably Hostel, the Saw films, Martyrs, individually, I think those are all interesting movies and have got things. It's just binge watching, which I think I did in order to write my torture porn chapter in the last edition of Nightmare Movies. It just becomes wearisome. It's a very narrow range of what's supposed to be horrific, and actually, so I think maybe some of the ones that seem to be aiming to make deeper statements are probably the ones that are more annoying, isn't it?
Are you thinking of the Serbian? Was it the Serbian movie or the Serbian film?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, but I don't particularly want ever to see it again. It's like I didn't. Yeah, I went and saw the remake of Martyrs. Yeah, so and I saw the remake of Funny Games as well, isn't it? It's like films that you can't get anybody to watch more than once unless you remake them in another language.
Yeah, God, Funny Games is definitely a film that I found extremely effective.
Yeah, and certainly, a lot of the discourse around that particular cycle of film tended to assume as if it was all meretricious exploitation movies, but certainly the Passion of the Christ and Michael Haneke's films seem to me to fit perfectly into that little blip of particularly gruesome torture type movies. And I think probably it had something to do with the zeitgeist of that phase of the war on terror. It's something that will I'm sure come back periodically. It may also be that was a form that burned itself out simply because people didn't really want to watch it anymore. Yeah, it shows that you can only go so far for a bit before people just get fed up with it. And for instance, every month, because I do the Empire column of all the non-theatrical movies, every month I see films which are wholly derivative of Night of the Living Dead, The Exorcist, Jaws, and Alien, all films made between 1968 and 1979. So 40 to 50 years later, these films are still being imitated. They're still making shark attack movies. They're still making zombie apocalypse movies. You can toss in Halloween. They're still making masked slasher movies. To me, it's kind of astonishing that maybe the only thing since Alien would be something like the Blair Witch Project, which because it advanced a particular type of horror that was inexpensive to make, has it's kind of artificially extended the life form of that cycle. Because if you're a starting filmmaker, found footage is still cheaper. And so that'll naturally be more appealing. And it, as a style, it reinvents itself every couple of years with different films. So it is a genuine addition to that. But on the one hand, it's sort of astonishing that these works have inspired such devotion. On the other hand, it's a bit sad, isn't it? That there are young filmmakers out here looking at 50-year-old movies and say, let's just make that. Not say, particularly it's the case of people who commission films rather than people who make films. People say, yeah, what do you want for your cable channel? Oh, get me some shark movies, you know.
Yeah, it's like Alien, but on a bus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's not in horror, but Die Hard is another touchstone movie that people are still imitating.
I saw Die Hard at the cinema and remember thinking that was okay, and the effect it had.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good action film, but it did not strike me as being amazingly original. And you can find instances of Die Hard type plot. I think that the text of Die Hard is Ernest Hemingway's novel To Have and Have Not, which ends with the hero who, unlike in the film, has only one arm, alone on a boat with a bunch of terrorists. And he picks them off one by one. Yeah, and it's like, oh yeah, that's the Die Hard plot. It wasn't used for the Howard Hawks, Humphrey Bogart movie, although the ending of Hemingway's To Have and Have Not was then used by John Huston as the ending for Key Largo, a film that otherwise is based on the play. But if you look at it, Key Largo is, if you want a text for a Die Hard movie, that's it.
You said earlier as well that in order to watch some films, you have to remake them in a different language. I was thinking about this as well in terms of what you just said in terms of where do we get fresh horror ideas from? Why do we keep going back to these avatars? Why isn't there a new? But it sort of occurs to me that where you do get really fresh ideas is from a different culture. It is from like The Ring coming out of Japanese horror, or even The Babadook coming out of from an Australian filmmaker.
Oh yeah, I mean every so often, horror as a genre absorbs it. Yeah, and in fact there was a whole cycle of Asian influenced horror movies. Although The Ring is based on a novel by a Japanese writer, Koji Suzuki, who sort of thought of himself as doing what Stephen King was doing, but in Japan. And actually, the whole premise of The Ring is very close to the premise of The Woman in Black. Although there it's pretty technological, but the haunting is kind of the same. So and I'm fascinated by odd little Phillips, like Mexican horror films with wrestlers, or La Llorona, the crying woman. What's interesting sometimes is not what's fresh and different, but what's the same, what's scary around the world. Different cultures who have different attitudes to the supernatural have different types of horror. And maybe now there's more access to it. I've been seeing more and more Indonesian horror films lately. There's been a little wave of activity there. And I'm never sure whether it's a wave of production activity or international distribution activity. Sometimes it is a film from a particular territory clicks, and so therefore the buyers go and scoop up everything that's remotely comparable.
I love the way as well that, as you were saying with the Blair Witch Project, where sometimes it's just a technical thing, like they've just discovered video cameras are working good enough to show films. Or another one I always notice is somebody somewhere figures out how to do a certain special effect, like getting somebody.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
His face stomped in, and suddenly you have 20 films from Drive to Kill List, all featuring a brutal face smashing in scene. Because somebody's just gone, oh, I figured out how to do it, guys.
In the early 80s, Stephen King wrote this really good book about horror called Dance Macabre, and he was sort of talking about the various types of horror. One of the things he said was, they've stopped making werewolf movies. There hasn't been a good one in 20 years. And of course, 20 minutes after his book came out, The Howling and American Werewolf in London and a whole bunch of other cat people came out. And that was purely because Rick Baker and Rob Bottin had independently invented a new way of depicting werewolf transformations on screen. And so therefore, a whole bunch of films started using it. I assume the same is true with monster movies after Jurassic Park, although we misremember Jurassic Park as the film that introduced CGI monsters. It has a lot more practical effects than CGI.
How did you start in this career, in this specialization? What's your origin story?
It's probably being allowed up late to watch the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula when I was 11. I mean, I because for years, I would sort of tell the story about this and how it started. But of course, now, thanks to the miracle of online listings and things, I can even find out the date. It's like I've got it written down somewhere. I found out the actual date in autumn 1970 when I watched Dracula on Westwood Television, and that, and then. After that, I became a kid who was just interested in monsters. Yeah, and I watched loads of horror films. They were not easy to see then. I read all the books, and that just mushroomed a bit to being interested in film in general, maybe even literature in general. And I think I started writing down notes about films somewhere in my teens. I find a lot of people who grow up to be film critics do the same kind of approach road thing. One is just to start keeping lists of what you've seen. I didn't keep a diary of it. I just started one year for Christmas. It just as one of the minor presents, I was given like a desk calendar. I think it was like a promotional for the garage or something. And on January the 1st, I watched a movie on television and I just wrote it on the calendar. I thought, oh, that's a good idea. And I just did that for a couple of years. I would have a calendar and I would write on it rather than appointments or useful stuff. I just write the films I'd seen and the days. And eventually that became unwieldy and I transferred it to a typed list. And I'd started keeping notes on some things and writing little capsule reviews, and that led some years later to writing for fanzines and university magazines and doing the program notes for Film Society screenings and that sort of stuff, which is what I did before I sold professionally as a film critic, which I did in the early 80s. There were a couple of markets then that were open to over the transom. I sent some clippings in from my fanzines and I wrote some samples and the Monthly Film Bulletin and City Limits, which was a London listings magazine that was a kind of rival to Time Out for a while. Both hired me. Or didn't hire me. They used me for freelance work. I've never actually had a job. I was still a freelance. And it was, I know that it's a very difficult business to break into now. I don't think it was that easy then, except there were opportunities. There were plenty of places that didn't pay very much, but would pay a little, and were looking for new voices or younger voices or just people to fill the pages. And also, I concentrated on the sadly extinct form of magazines that felt obliged to review everything, because therefore I realized there are a whole bunch of things that nobody really wants to see. I'll just go and see those, review them. And actually, horror films were sort of part of that, although it was not a completely despised form. There were lower things. I remember having to go and see things like the sequels to Porky's, and all that. The utter dreck. And I saw like the My Little Pony movie and all that sort of thing.
Oh, talk about mean-spirited.
Yeah, and I was willing to go and write actual reviews of those films. And that seems to be, that was your rite of passage then. So that's how I started out.
Were you always writing like creatively as well at the same time?
Yes, I was. I never really separated the two. I think just through sheer coincidence, I think I sold my first short story. I wrote the first short story of mine that sold in the same month that I first placed some criticism professionally. So from very early on, and actually I'm quite pleased. Well, I think that was a good thing now, because looking back on it, if one had taken off and the other hadn't, I might have dropped the one that wasn't selling. Yeah, right. I might not have. And I sold a science fiction story to a magazine called Interzone, which was a 1980s startup. And again, we're looking for newish writers. And there was a little group of us who were all sort of interested in having our own little wave of what was going on in science fiction and horror at the time. And because I sold to them, I felt that, it was worth sticking with the fiction, because fiction was harder to get established in than non-fiction. Having a sense that both avenues were worth pursuing was a good thing. And I've done that throughout. Yeah, I think there have been years where I've concentrated on one to the expense of the other, but I've never entirely abandoned either.
Yeah, I don't know. I've published a novel in the past, and I'm still pursuing the creative writing strand, and it feels to me, I don't know if you have the same feeling, but if I've had chapters in books, and I'm writing a film book at the moment, and it doesn't feel like a book the way a novel feels like a book to me.
Yeah, I've written fairly substantial books about film as well as novels, but yeah, I mean, I think I suppose the thing is, novels are all entirely out of my head, even though most of my novels stand in relationship to real life or indeed to film, or media. So I quite often find nuggets of story in that. But yeah, no, it certainly involves more of me personally, I think.
And your marvelous Anno Dracula books as well. I've got to ask you about those. I mean, where did that come from? That inspiration.
The inspiration came from, it was a university course, which proves that there was a reason to take an English degree. I did a course on it was called Late Victorian Revolt. It was about Victorian popular culture and various upheavals, and it was taught by Norman Mackenzie, who was H.G. Wells's biographer, and the poet Lawrence Lerner. And it was a really good course. It made me read a lot of interesting 19th century books I hadn't read before. And I wrote a thesis on this guy, and it was about apocalyptic fictions, War of the Worlds, stuff like that. And there was a chapter in that about invasion narratives. Indeed, War of the Worlds is one, or the Battle of Dorking, all these stories about the German and the French army taking over London, which there were a lot of in the late 19th century. And as a footnote, I sort of said, and Bram Stoker's Dracula can be considered as an invasion narrative. And then it occurred to me that, the first third of Dracula is like the first third of War of the Worlds. And then Dracula gets distracted from whatever his huge scheme is by a sort of soap opera plot. It's like he's chasing the wife of a provincial solicitor rather than taking over the country. And it just stuck in the back of my mind. It'd be interesting to do a story in which he did take over the country. And lo and behold, and again, like quite a lot of my ideas, that was on my docket for some years before I wrote it. And not quite as long as Something More Than Night, but it was a good 10 years between that footnote and the first version of, I did a novella version of Anno Dracula before I did it as a novel. So that was 10 years of it percolating is the word you used, and that's the word I use as well. Yeah, maybe it's more like a compost heap. Bury it deep and pour stuff on it, and hope that eventually, something will grow out of it. But
steam rises from the.
Yeah, that's right. And I've got various other ideas like that I've not got round to yet. But yeah, that once I'd done I think it's maybe the only instance where I've started a novel realizing that it was going to be a series rather than a novel. Although, of course, when I was writing the first one, there was a period where I thought only I am going to be interested in this. So I thought maybe it's not a series, maybe it's a book. But then it came out and people liked it, and I had ideas for the next two. I think I knew going in, and then since then, every couple of years, another idea has come along and is needed to be done as an Anno Dracula book. It's not a planned out series like George Martin or J.R. Tolkien. It's not a story that's got an end or a climax. But it's a world I can visit and tell stories within.
I was wondering if you'd thought of combining the two.
How do you mean?
Something More Than Night and Anno Dracula.
Yeah.
Because you do have, was it Dracula Cha-Cha-Cha sort of goes into the world of...
Yeah, true. And I've done, in Johnny Alucard, one of the Anno Dracula books, there's a section that's narrated by Philip Marlowe. So I have done a Chandler stretch in that. Bela Lugosi appears in one of the novels as well, for obvious reasons. I'm sure Boris Karloff is at least mentioned in the books. It'd be strange if he wasn't. Probably in Johnny Alucard, which has a lot of movie stuff in it. Yeah, no, it's not quite a fit, but all my books connect together at some juncture. Even Something More Than Night is a standalone, but a couple of characters have been in some of my earlier books.
It's back to that sort of universe building, isn't it? Of, everything connecting together.
Yeah, it's hard not to do, yeah. But in my case, it is a multiverse rather than a universe.
That gives you more freedom, because in the end, the universe, the sort of creative idea of the universe becomes a bit confining. I mean, it's like Star Wars. It's like three planets. I thought there was a galaxy out there.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when your ongoing continuity prevents you from telling certain types of stories or from doing certain things, then that's when you need to change it up. It's when you realize you trapped yourself, which I think we all do to some extent. But there is a point where you think, no, I want the freedom to go off and take this in a slightly different direction. I suspect that's not entirely a recipe for commercial success, but it's a recipe for me not going crazy, and I'm all in favor of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to sort of take those ideas and go somewhere. I mean, that's slightly the problem with what we were talking about earlier about the comic book movies, is the trajectory of the sort of Joseph Campbell hero's journey, which they all seem to be, have as a template. It's just a kind of dull story after you've seen it for the 20th time, Yeah,
and as a long time comic book reader, I actually quite appreciate the way, particularly now that Marvel are using some of their TV shows to do different things. I always thought the strength of Marvel as a comics sort of universe is they could do the Punisher and they could do Howard the Duck, and they could have Howard the Duck meet the Punisher. That gave you a range of possibilities, from grim, intense, depressing, on the streets criminal vigilante, to just goofy, and without feeling the need to say that this wasn't the same world, because the real world ranges from awful to silly. in kind of interesting way. I'm not sure if in say the Anna Dracula universe I'd go as far as Howard the Duck.
Maybe the Sparks brothers, though.
Maybe, yeah, they are. But I think that what I was trying to do with them was comedians who are scary, which is sort of an interesting. I might go as far as Squirrel Girl, who's a particular favorite of mine.
When you sort of specialized in horror, although your interests are much broader than that.
Well, I wrote a book about westerns purely to prove that I knew about other things.
Speaking about the Sparks brothers, there was a Western actor in Italy called Clint Westwood.
Yeah, I know. There's an Italian horror film which has a monster played by somebody called Boris Lugosi. Although when you see it, it's a very recognizable face of somebody who's in a lot of Italian movies under another name or several other names.
That's the joy. I mean, I watch a lot of it. I'm based in Italy, so I watch a lot of Italian movies. And one of the joys is that, all the actors from the spaghetti westerns turn up in really serious, great movies as well. I mean, a lot of the spaghetti westerns were great, but it's just so interesting to see such range. And these guys, I mean, Pasolini is in a spaghetti western. Just shows
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, Recreation Act. Yeah.
So what I was going to ask about the horror genre specifically is, as what you've called it, a sort of genre of effect. Do you ever get that effect out of all that familiarity? Is there a moment where you go, "Oh Christ, this is too scary for me," or something like that?
I can still be profoundly scared or affected. It's harder to surprise me. That's the thing is once you've watched a lot of horror films, there used to be this worry that you get desensitized. I think, if anything, I'm more sensitive, but it's really hard to trick me because it's like I know all the punchlines, and I always really appreciate it when a film does do something that I didn't expect or haven't seen coming. Although sometimes that's not satisfying either, because it's a complete break with your engagement with the story, as if they pull a twist out of left field that makes no sense whatsoever. Whereas what you want from a twist is, oh, I should have seen that. And you didn't.
Yeah, is it? Oh, that was that. Yeah, it's so obvious, of course. But no. And in terms of sort of the more recent developments with horror, we're kind of, in terms of acceptance of horror, it's no longer the sort of transgressive, looked down upon genre.
All kind of sort of genres like to feel they're despised and spat on, don't they? It's like everybody compete. Yeah, there are lower forms than horror. I mean, romance. People give a hard time to people who write that stuff. Yeah. No, I think that there are still a few people who just who have influential voices who just don't like the idea of horror, who don't understand it, who don't get it. And it is that, whereas nobody says they don't like the idea of comedy. I don't know, do people who specialize in writing about comedy lose the ability to laugh?
I mean, I would argue that sort of modern comedy is incredibly difficult to do, or it's incredibly difficult to find any acceptance. It needs a few years before people go, actually, that comedy Will Ferrell did 5 years ago we should actually take it seriously as a film, because at the moment it's just like, it's easy to dismiss, I guess. I'm trying to bait you on Will Ferrell. Get your Will Ferrell point of view.
I think he's quite talented, but the last couple of things I saw him in weren't good. But I saw that Sherlock Holmes movie he did, which just didn't work as a parody, and it didn't work as a sort of straight ahead film either. And it sort of makes you realize that there are ways of telling this story in a fun manner, but just casting Sherlock Holmes as a comedy idiot doesn't work.
Gene Wilder and Marty Feldman did
that worked better. And I think maybe actually Billy Wilder's Sherlock Holmes film is sort of comic, but also very melancholy. The one that for me doesn't work and because of the casting, and yet is a brilliant idea, is Without a Clue. The whole idea is that Sherlock Holmes is an actor who's required to be Sherlock Holmes. But the trouble is they cast Michael Caine, who couldn't play Sherlock Holmes. That film would be much funnier if it starred Peter O'Toole or somebody tall and thin and intense, who you might believe as Sherlock Holmes, who then you slowly realize is a complete idiot. But casting Kane is a sort of, a lumpy presence in that.
I didn't mind that Will Ferrell film that much, but that was only because I saw it after everybody said it was absolute waste of time and terrible. So
Yeah.
I sort of watched it and thought, well, it's not that bad.
But it is that particular breed of modern star comedies that don't have a single laugh. You might smile occasionally. Yeah, they're not too long, they're not boring, but they're not funny,
Yeah. It's that sort of, let's put John C. Reilly and Will Ferrell together and we've got the package, so we don't really need a script.
Yeah, that's right. Or jokes. And actually, I mean, I think it's perfectly possible to make a very funny comedy film without jokes. But that kind of parody does require jokes. Will Ferrell's style or Adam Sandler's style are very close to Bob Hope, a man who surrounded himself with joke writers, or the Saturday Night Live crew of the original, the Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi. They required material. They were funny people, but they needed jokes. And it seems to me that we're obviously running thin of the kind of comedy writers who can do that sort of shtick. Not that we haven't got some genuinely brilliant people working in the field.
Yeah, I guess the similar thing with, well, I mean, it seems to be with every genre at the moment. If you want to watch horror, there's a heck of a lot of horror television available on Netflix and on other streaming services, and superhero movies. They've got a whole channel, and as far as comedy is concerned, you don't really go to the movies for the comedy. You go to your 25-minute animated series or sitcoms
although comedy still, I mean, actually maybe because the ecology of the cinema has been so changed over the last 2 years, it's hard to tell. But it used to be a reliable thing. Every year there would be a couple of mid-range, mid-budget comedy, Melissa McCarthy movies or whatever, and 1 in 4 of those would be really good, would be genuinely funny, have good ideas in it, would connect emotionally, and everybody would love it. And then there'd be 3 other ones which were just terrible, right? Yeah. And often made by or starring the same people. I don't think there's anyone in the modern era who is as consistent in terms of comedy star vehicles as Bob Hope was, or Woody Allen until he decided to turn serious. Yeah, someone who was funny every time out. Yeah,
Jim Carrey had a good run. He did like 4 or 5,
but then crashed.
Yes.
Same with Mike Myers. Yeah, but also for instance, I think that were he interested, Steve Coogan could be that kind of comedian. But he's also sort of interested in being a good actor as well. So and actually, it's interesting. Will Ferrell and Adam Sandler both have really strong acting credits that don't seem to affect their ongoing careers in declining comedy vehicles.
I remember seeing The Wedding Singer at the cinema and not knowing anything about Adam Sandler, because obviously we didn't get SNL as much as we do now, and just thinking, wow, this is brilliant. He's charming, it's funny, it's kind of kind-hearted, and then it all went a little bit pear-shaped. One last question. Well, a couple of final questions for you. The first one is, what's your next project? What are you working on next in terms of your book, if you can talk about it?
Good point, because actually I can't reveal. I've
God damn it! Why did I say if you can talk about it?
I've signed on to 2 things that I can't talk about yet, but I am working on something. I'm not just sitting here, But watch this space for later in the year. But a good rule of thumb in this business: anybody who wants you to sign a non-disclosure agreement is an asshole. But anybody who asks you just not to say anything about this yet, fine, I will. Yeah.
Fair enough. And the final question then, and this one I'm sure you haven't signed an NDA on. What film book would you recommend for our listeners?
This is Carlos Claren's horror movies, this is called. It's also published as an illustrated history of the horror film. This was like the first serious film book I read. I mean, I think it was first published I'm looking up, 1967. And it's like the first attempt to look at horror films not just as a bunch of movies, but to see a coherent story that starts with Georges Méliès and goes through German Silence and Universal Horror, Val Lewton, 1950s Hammer, all that kind of stuff. And what really influenced me, apart from the fact it was about films I loved and it was full of, there's a list at the back, and this isn't my original copy because my original copy fell apart. But the list at the back I went through and I ticked off the ones I'd seen, and all this stuff, and I'd looked at longingly at the ones that I thought were never going to play on television anywhere near me and I'd never get to see. But it's the fact that it managed to make a story out of it, and that, more than anything else, when I was writing nightmare movies, was that I was looking at, and in fact, my approach to genre is slightly different from Carlos Claren's. I see overlapping subgeneric cycles seem to be is the main thrust of film history. But seeing a way about, and it's just a way of getting your head around something that is otherwise a long list of many thousands of films that quite often are hard to distinguish from each other. Find the story. And the other thing, and Carlos Clarence, who also wrote a really good book about gangster movies, he paid attention to the quality of the prose. And I think that's a thing that whenever anybody asks me about, what do I do to get into the business, or what should I assume if you want to be a film critic, you already love movies and you've seen a lot of them and all that kind of stuff. So I can't help you with that. But one thing you can work on is just the quality of the writing. Write sentences that sing without being too fussy. And obviously, the besetting sin of my profession and my generation is being too clever by half. So work really hard to cut that out.
Yes, absolutely. That's brilliant advice. I totally agree with that advice. Superb. When you mentioned lists, just one last thing, I promise you.
No.
What was a film that was like on that list that you didn't see for ages and ages, and it was like I'll never see this film, and then you saw it? Have you got an example of that for us?
Well, the thing is with the horror classics, apart from like the ones that are lost, London After Midnight and the Murnau version of Jekyll and Hyde, I think I had probably seen everything significant by the mid-1980s. Because that was the point when suddenly things that had seemed unlikely ever to be available here. I mean, stuff that had been banned as well, but also stuff, there was the idea that a Blood Feast or something was just never going to have any form of release in Britain because it couldn't be shown on television. It didn't come around the cinemas. There wasn't that much interest in it, frankly. By the 80s, those things were starting to show at rep cinemas that I was going to. So, I'm not sure what the last sort of really big, major classic horror tick was for me, as it were. But it would have been sometime in the 80s I would have caught up with the last. And there are still, I know what it was. It was the original Japanese version of Godzilla.
Ah, right.
Difficult to see for a long time. We saw the Raymond Burr version, although weirdly, I think in the end I saw the Japanese version dubbed into German first before seeing the Raymond version. And so that was the one that went from being utterly obscure and difficult to see to now being readily accessible. But in terms of things that I just haven't seen because I've not got round to it, I have in the last couple of years been doing something as sort of an annual tradition, which is on New Year's Day, I will try and watch an absolute stone classic that everybody says is great, that somehow I have failed to watch beforehand. And so over the last couple of years, and it's only a year or so back, I watched Carl Dreyer's Trial of Joan of Arc, for instance.
Right.
Which is, and actually, Ken Loach's Kess, I only saw that 2 years ago. Again, something that, you get the point once you miss something from the canon, it takes a long time to motivate yourself to catch up. And this year, and in fact, it was not one film. I realized I had seen 2 of the Three Colors trilogy, but not, I think, Three Colors Blue I'd missed. So I watched all 3 over the New Year period. So I have caught up with that. Only 20 years too late.
You're just turning up to every conversation going, I've just seen this new film. It's amazing.
I know. And I'd like to sort of big up that as a thing to do, because I occasionally get the sense that I have an image of being somebody who's seen everything and is changed about it. It's not true. There are plenty of things I've not seen that I am capable of being excited. And the thing is, there is so much good stuff out there that is easily accessible. In my case, I have piles the size of a 1950s fridge of unwatched DVDs and Blu-rays. And I know in there's an enormous amount of really outstanding, terrific material that I've just not got around to. I will eventually.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kim.
We're happy to do it.
I hope you enjoyed that. It was a great conversation. It was great talking to Kim. He's a writer who I've read and admired over the years in Sight and Sound, in Empire, and lots of different places, as well as his books, obviously. And his novels are really worth reading if you haven't already had the pleasure. They're an absolute treat. It always reminds me a little bit as well of a sort of 2000 AD imagination. For some reason, I just, growing up in the 1980s and starting to read comic books, and there was a moment in my life when I shifted from warlord and battle and all those quite grotesque, violent fantasies, and landed with, I think it was Eagle was one of the first comics I was buying, and then 2000 AD, and then somebody gave me all their back copies, all their old copies of 2000 AD, and I read them, and Strontium Dog and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, I just think, Kim's got that kind of imagination that sort of it incorporates all that kind of love of the Gothic, love of what Jonathan Rigby was talking about last week, of the sort of furniture of horror as well, the sort of candelabras. He's got encyclopedic knowledge. Which is handy because he kind of writes the encyclopedia on horror as well. So that was a fantastic conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, we're going to have a little bit of a change next week, because I recognize that we have done a couple of horror podcasts and writers in a row. So the next podcast is going to be a little bit of a change in subject, and we're going to be looking at the Mankiewicz brothers. So if you are interested in Mank, as he was called, or his brother Joseph Mankiewicz, then you should definitely download the episode next week. Thanks to Elliot Atkins, thank you for the music. Thank you to Ali Harwood for the art. And thank you, listener. I couldn't do it without you. I could do it without you, but it would be a lonely, lonely, sad thing. So thanks very much for listening. And until next week, please take care.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.